The brass casings hit the concrete, a rhythmic ticking against the heavy afternoon silence. She didn't want to be a trailblazer. She didn't want the suffocating media circus. She just wanted to hit the steel. But when the smoke finally cleared, the harshest commander in the teams didn't speak. He just saluted. The Coronado Sun didn't care about history, and it certainly didn't care about headlines. It just baked the asphalt of Range 4 until the air above it shimmered, turning a 20-pound plate carrier into a wearable oven. Riley Cole stood alone at the firing line. She pressed a fresh magazine into the well of her rifle. Click. The mechanical finality of the sound grounded her. Here, there were no cameras, no politicians in tailored suits shaking her hand for a photo op. No sterile briefing rooms where officers used words like integration and milestone while carefully avoiding eye contact. Here there was only copper, lead, and steel. The physics of it didn't give a damn about her gender. A 5.56 round either hit the target or it didn't. Riley wiped a line of stinging sweat from her eye with the back of a calloused, tape-wrapped hand. Her body was a map of chronic, low-grade agony. Her right knee clicked every time she dropped into a kneeling position, a souvenir from a brutal night jump over the Arizona desert. Her lower back hummed with the phantom weight of a rucksack she had carried for endless miles during Hell Week. She was a SEAL. The media had a field day with it, the first. The news anchors painted her as a superhero, a feminist icon who broke the ultimate glass ceiling with a triumphant, easy smile. They didn't see the locker room. They didn't see the profound, deafening silence that greeted her every morning when she walked in. The guys in her platoon weren't monsters. They weren't cartoonish villains actively trying to sabotage her. It was worse than that. They were profoundly skeptical. They were waiting for her to break. In their world, a weak link didn't mean a failed quarterly report. It meant someone came home in a box, draped with a flag. They had spent their entire careers relying on a brotherhood forged in savage, primal violence. Now a woman was standing in their circle, mandated by Congress. Riley didn't blame them. But the isolation was heavy. It was a physical weight, heavier than the ceramic plate strapped to her chest. She couldn't have a bad day. She couldn't show fatigue. If a guy missed a shot, he was having an off day. If Riley missed a shot, it was biological proof that women didn't belong in the teams. She raised the rifle. The red dot hovered over the center of the steel silhouette, 50 yards away. Breathe in, exhale, squeeze, ping. The sharp, metallic ring echoed across the empty range. Ping, ping, ping. She ran the trigger fast, managing the recoil with a violent, locked-in grip. Her stance was aggressive, leaning into the weapon. She dumped the magazine, the empty polymer shell hitting the dirt before she had already grabbed a fresh one from her belt. She fed it, sent the bolt home, and fired 2 more rounds into the head box of the target. Ping, ping, silence. She lowered the weapon. Her breathing was heavy, ragged in the humid air. She checked her watch. She had been out here for 3 hours. The official training schedule ended at 1400. It was nearly 1700. The base was emptying out. The sounds of cars leaving the parking lots drifted over the berms. Everyone else was at the bar, unwinding, complaining about the brass, being brothers. Riley reloaded her empty magazines, her thumbs bruised from pressing rounds through the stiff feed lips. She didn't have the luxury of going to the bar. If she went, she'd be the elephant in the room. Conversations would stall. Jokes would be filtered. She would be the officer everyone had to watch their mouths around. So she stayed at the range. The range was honest. The steel targets didn't care if she was a man or a woman. They only responded to competence. She stepped back to the 75-yard line. This was the cynic's reality. She wasn't out here to prove a point to the world anymore. She was out here because the margin for error in her new life was precisely zero. She was out here because the fear of letting those skeptical men down, of proving them right in a firefight, kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her barren apartment. Riley dropped to the dirt, ignoring the sharp rocks digging through her pants. Prone position. She dialed in her breathing. The wind was picking up, blowing grit across her face, pasting dust to the sweat on her neck. She closed her eyes for a split second, seeing the faces of the instructors from her training pipeline. The ones who had looked at her with cold, empty eyes, waiting for the bell to ring. Waiting for her to quit. She opened her eyes. The target was sharp. Crack. Ping. She was just getting started. Commander Thomas stood on the catwalk of the observation tower, a shadow against the glaring afternoon sun. He hadn't planned on stopping by Range 4. He was supposed to be doing paperwork, drafting readiness reports for a deployment that was coming up too fast. But he had heard the rhythmic, unbroken strings of fire echoing across the base for the last 2 hours. It was relentless. Nobody shot that much on a Friday afternoon unless they were angry or they were trying to exorcise a demon. Thomas was a relic. He had 22 years in the teams. His knuckles were permanently scarred, his hearing was shot, and he possessed the cold, detached demeanor of a man who had buried too many friends. He wasn't a politician. He despised the Pentagon brass who pushed social experiments into his combat units. When he was told his new platoon commander would be the much-publicized female SEAL, he hadn't argued. He had simply nodded. His philosophy was simple. Combat doesn't grade on a curve. You perform, or people die. He fully expected Riley Cole to wash out, not because of prejudice, but because the human body, male or female, rarely survived the meat grinder without snapping. He leaned against the rusted railing of the tower, looking down. Down in the dirt, Riley was setting up a barricade drill. She was dragging heavy wooden barricades into a zigzag pattern, her boots kicking up clouds of white dust. Thomas watched her haul a 90-pound simulated casualty dummy by its drag strap, pulling it behind a rusted car door. She wasn't moving with the bouncy energy of a fresh recruit. She was moving with the slow, deliberate plod of someone who is deeply, thoroughly exhausted. Good, Thomas thought. The real test never begins until the tank is empty. Down on the line, Riley hit the button on her shot timer and immediately sprinted toward the first barricade. The buzzer shrieked. She hit the dirt, sliding behind the wood, and shoved the barrel of her rifle through a narrow, awkwardly cut hole near the ground. Crack, ping. She didn't pause. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning the rifle on its sling, and drew her sidearm while moving laterally to the next piece of cover. This wasn't standard static shooting. This was dynamic, ugly, heart rate spiking work. Thomas watched her footwork. It was flawless. No crossed ankles, no wasted movement. She moved like water around the edges of the barricades. She fired 3 rounds from her pistol into a steel silhouette. Clack, clack, clack. Then it happened. On the 4th shot, her pistol jammed. A failure to eject. The empty brass casing was caught in the ejection port, sticking out like a stovepipe. From the tower, Thomas narrowed his eyes. This was the moment. When exhaustion sets in and the heart rate is redlining at 170 beats per minute, fine motor skills disintegrate. The brain panics. Amateurs stare at the jammed weapon, completely forgetting they are in a simulated firefight. Riley didn't freeze. She didn't even look down at the gun. She kept her eyes locked down range on the target. In one violent, fluid motion, she brought her support hand up, bladed her palm, and viciously racked the slide, sweeping the jammed brass out of the port. The malfunction cleared, a live round chambered, and she immediately pushed the gun back out. Bang! A dead-center hit on the steel. The total time of the malfunction was less than a second. Thomas felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his jaw. It was grudging respect. You couldn't teach that kind of instinct in a classroom. That only came from thousands of hours of bleeding in the dirt. Riley kept moving. She reached the casualty dummy. The drill required her to shoot one-handed, while dragging the dead weight backwards. She holstered her pistol, grabbed her rifle with her right hand, and grabbed the drag strap of the dummy with her left. She heaved. The dummy weighed almost as much as she did. Her boots slipped in the loose gravel. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly effort. The muscles in her neck stood out like steel cables. She pulled. 10 feet, 15 feet. She braced the rifle against her shoulder, using only her right hand to support the heavy weapon. It wavered. Her arm was trembling from the sheer lactic acid buildup. Hold it together, she thought, the taste of copper flooding her dry mouth. Don't pull the shot. Don't let it beat you. From above, Thomas watched the barrel of her rifle shaking. He knew exactly how heavy that weapon felt right now. He knew the burning sensation tearing through her shoulder blade. Riley let out a sharp, guttural breath, stabilized the trembling barrel for a microsecond, and pulled the trigger. Ping! A hit. She dropped the dummy, letting it hit the dirt with a heavy thud, and collapsed back against the barricade. The shot timer beeped, signaling the end of the drill. Riley let her head fall back against the wood, her chest heaving violently. Sweat poured down her face, cutting tracks through the thick layer of carbon and dust. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely press the magazine release to clear her weapon. She felt broken. Every joint screamed. She sat there in the dirt, entirely alone, trying to find the energy to stand up and do it all over again. She didn't know someone was watching. She didn't know that 50 feet above her, the most unforgiving commander in the United States Navy was staring down at her, seeing not a female operator, not a headline, and not a political mandate. He saw a SEAL. Thomas quietly backed away from the railing, careful not to let his boots scrape against the metal grating. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't call down to offer praise. Praise was cheap. But as he walked down the stairs of the tower, fading into the descending California twilight, the old cynic realized something profound. The brass in Washington had sent him a symbol, but down there in the dust, bleeding and exhausted, the symbol had decided to forge herself into a weapon, and God help anyone who stood in her way. Tuesday morning smelled like damp plywood, sweat, and unburnt cordite. The kill house was a sprawling, modular structure of bullet-absorbing rubber walls and heavy wooden doors sitting on the edge of the training compound. It was designed to simulate the claustrophobic nightmare of close-quarters battle. CQB wasn't a game of marksmanship. It was a brutal, unforgiving math problem. It was about angles, speed, and absolute, unflinching trust. Riley stood in the stack, fourth man in a line of heavily armed phantoms. The ready room had been suffocatingly quiet. Nobody had spoken to her outside of operational necessity. There were no high fives, no pep talks. Miller, the point man, had simply outlined the floor plan on the whiteboard with a dry erase marker. Hayes, the breacher carrying a heavy shotgun and a rack of flashbangs, had verified his explosive loads. They treated her like a piece of equipment that hadn't yet proven its reliability in the field. She preferred it that way. Condescending encouragement would have been worse. The physical pressure of the stack grounded her. She stood inches behind Hayes, the rigid plates of her body armor occasionally bumping his back as the line compressed. Her right hand gripped her rifle. Her left hand rested lightly on Hayes's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In this tight, dark hallway, gender evaporated. They were just four biological machines programmed to deliver violence faster than the opposition. Miller raised 2 fingers. 2 seconds. Hayes stepped up to the door. He didn't kick it. Kicking was for the movies. He placed a customized explosive charge against the locking mechanism, stepped back, and turned his head away. Boom! The shockwave punched the air out of Riley's lungs. Dust blew back into the hallway, coating her goggles. Before the heavy wooden door even hit the floor, Miller was through the frame, dissolving into the smoke. Hayes followed, going right. Number 3 went left. Riley pushed forward. The fatal funnel, the doorway where most operators died, whipped past her peripheral vision. She entered the room, snapping her rifle up, her eyes processing information at a frantic, terrifying speed. It was a cluttered living room setup. Paper targets with printed faces stared back at her from the shadows. Target, threat, civilian, threat. Her brain categorized the shapes in milliseconds. Miller was already engaging the deep left corner. Hayes had the right. Riley took the center, stepping fluidly into the dead space between her teammates. A target holding a simulated AK-47 popped up from behind a heavy leather couch. Riley didn't think. She didn't consciously aim. Years of muscle memory took over. She brought the red dot to the upper thoracic cavity of the paper threat. Crack, crack, 2 rounds. The paper snapped backward. She kept moving. Her footwork was a low, rolling glide, designed to keep her upper body perfectly stable. She swept her muzzle past a target holding a cell phone, a no-shoot, and immediately locked onto a hostile target partially obscured by a doorway leading to a kitchen. She squeezed the trigger. Click. Her rifle had run dry. The silence of that click in a live kill house was deafening. It was the sound of a mistake. In combat, it was the sound of dying. Riley didn't pause to look at the ejection port. She didn't shout, "Reloading," to a team that was already moving too fast to care. She dropped the rifle, letting the sling catch it against her chest, and drew her sidearm in a single, blurring motion. She punched the pistol forward, finding the front sight post in the gloom. Bang! Bang! The hostile target in the kitchen doorway took 2 rounds to the center of mass. "Clear!" Miller barked from the left. "Clear!" Hayes shouted from the right. Riley lowered her pistol slightly, scanning her sector one last time. "Clear center." The thick tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by the heavy breathing of 4 operators coming off an adrenaline dump. The air was thick with the grey smoke of the breaching charge and the sharp, metallic smell of copper. Hayes turned around, his shotgun resting on his hip. He looked at the target in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the 2 neat holes punched through the cardboard chest. Then he looked at the rifle dangling from Riley's sling. He didn't say a word. He just gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, turned back to the door, and grunted, "Stack up, next room." Riley holstered her pistol and reloaded her rifle as she moved back into line. Her hands were steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. That nod from Hayes was worth more than a congressional medal. It meant she wasn't a liability. It meant she had done her job. Up on the steel catwalk overlooking the maze of plywood rooms, Commander Thomas leaned over the railing. He had watched the entire sequence through the overhead monitors and the open roof of the facility. He had seen the transition. He had seen the speed. Most importantly, he had seen how she fit into the team. A bad operator tries to take over a room, pushing past their teammates to get the shots, hunting for glory. A dead operator freezes when their primary weapon fails. Riley had simply filled the void. When the gap opened, she stepped into it. When the gun died, she bypassed the problem. She didn't disrupt the violent choreography of the squad, she enhanced it. Thomas looked down at his clipboard, holding the timing sheet. They were running 3 seconds faster than the platoon average. He clicked his pen, wrote a single checkmark next to Cole's name, and walked away from the railing. The cynic in him was finally starting to quiet down. By 2100 hours, the naval base was swallowed by a thick, clinging Pacific fog. The halogen lights in the parking lot cast long, sickly yellow cones through the mist. The armory was empty, save for Riley. She sat at a scarred metal workbench, a white shop towel spread out in front of her. Her rifle was field-stripped into a dozen black, oily components. The sharp smell of solvent burned the inside of her nose. She was scraping carbon off the bolt carrier group with a specialized metal pick. It was tedious, filthy work. Her hands were black with grease, the knuckles wrapped in dirty white medical tape to cover the blisters that had torn open and bled during the barricade drills. Her shoulders ached with a dull, throbbing intensity that promised a sleepless night. She was exhausted to her marrow. The day had been a brutal gauntlet. After the kill house, they had run 3 miles of beach in full kit, followed by 2 hours of tactical trauma care drills, where she had carried Hayes, 220 pounds of dead weight, up a sand berm while pretending he was missing a leg. Nobody had cheered for her. Nobody had offered her a lighter load. The guys had treated her exactly the way they treated each other, with ruthless, unsympathetic expectation. It was the best day she'd had since joining the teams. She picked up a brass brush and started scrubbing the star chamber of the rifle barrel, her movements rhythmic and hypnotic. Heavy bootsteps echoed on the concrete floor behind her. Riley didn't turn around. She kept scrubbing. "I locked the cages, Miller. If you left your night vision in the van again, you're explaining it to the quartermaster." "It's not Miller." Riley froze. She immediately recognized the low, gravelly voice. She set the brass brush down, wiped her greasy hands on a rag, and stood up, turning to face the door. Commander Thomas stood in the entryway. He wasn't wearing his standard uniform blouse. He wore a faded green fleece jacket, his hands shoved deep into the pockets. The harsh overhead lights cast deep shadows into the lines of his face. He looked every bit the 20-year veteran, battered, tired, and deeply unamused by the world. "Commander," Riley said, her posture stiffening slightly. Thomas walked into the armory, his eyes drifting over the disassembled weapon on her bench. He didn't look at the media, darling. He looked at the tools of the trade. He checked the extractor pins sitting on the towel. He looked at the heavy layer of carbon she was currently fighting to remove. "You crowded Hayes on room 4, Thomas said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Riley didn't blink. She knew exactly what he was talking about. During the 4th breach of the day, she had stepped too far to the right, closing the distance between her and the breacher by a foot. It was a minor infraction, but in a real room, a foot could mean a friendly fire incident. "Yes, sir. I over-penetrated off the fatal funnel. I was anticipating the blind corner." "Don't anticipate," Thomas replied, looking up to meet her eyes. "Anticipation gets you killed. You read the room as it is, not as you expect it to be. You trust the man next to you to hold his sector." "Understood, sir." "Your transition on room 2, however." Thomas paused. He pulled a hand out of his pocket and tapped a finger against the edge of the metal workbench. That was adequate. From Thomas, adequate was the highest compliment a human being could receive. It meant you hadn't died, and you hadn't gotten anyone else killed. Riley gave a small, curt nod. "Thank you, sir." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the unspoken weight of the last few months. He saw the black grease smeared across her cheek. He saw the frayed, bloody tape on her knuckles. He saw the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her eyes. He didn't see a woman trying to prove a point. He saw a pipe hitter who just wanted to do the work. "The media is coming back next week," Thomas said quietly. "Brass wants a photo op. They want to show the world how progressive we are. They want you front and center in dress whites, smiling for the cameras." Riley felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The range, the kill house, the dirt. That was where she belonged. The cameras were a suffocating prison. "Am I ordered to attend, sir?" Thomas looked at the disassembled rifle on the bench. Then he looked back at her. "I told them my platoon commander is currently engaged in a critical readiness cycle and cannot be disturbed for public relations exercises," Thomas said. His tone was perfectly even, but there was a faint, dangerous edge to it. "I told them if they want to take pictures, they can take pictures of me. I'm told I photograph terribly." Riley let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. A genuine brief smile cracked the dirt on her face. "Thank you, Commander." "Don't thank me, Cole. If your times drop, I'll throw you to the press corps myself." "They won't drop. See that they don't." Thomas turned away, walking back toward the heavy metal door of the armory. The fog outside was swirling into the entryway, thick and grey. He stopped at the threshold. The halogen lights caught the silver eagle on his collar. For a man who despised politics, who hated the shifting tides of the modern military, he understood the raw, unyielding nature of respect. Respect couldn't be mandated by Congress. It couldn't be forced by a policy change. It had to be dragged out of the dirt, bleeding and screaming, through sheer, undeniable competence. Riley Cole had paid the toll. Thomas didn't turn around. He didn't offer a dramatic speech or a warm smile. He simply squared his shoulders toward the dark parking lot, raised his right hand, and delivered a slow, crisp, perfectly executed salute to the empty air of the doorframe. It was silent. It was absolute. He held it for 2 seconds, dropped his arm, and walked out into the fog, disappearing into the California night. Riley stood perfectly still in the quiet armory. The solvent burned her nose. Her back ached. Her knuckles throbbed. She looked down at the dirty shop towel, picked up the bolt carrier group, and went back to work. Tomorrow was Wednesday. They had a 6-mile sea swim at 0400. She had to be ready. Riley's journey wasn't about breaking glass ceilings for the cameras. It was about the brutal, uncompromising reality of earning her place in the dirt, blood, and brass. True respect is not handed out in press briefings. It is earned in the shadows, when your tank is empty and no one is watching. If Riley's relentless grit and the commander's silent salute moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to keep fighting, and subscribe.